Good afternoon, students. Hope y'all are doing well today. I apologize, my voice isn't still fully back, so chances are you're going to hear it go out at least once or twice as we're going through today. But I kind of wanted to go through either way, give you guys that live stream right before this exam, make sure you guys were prepared. I'm going to go ahead. I'm just going to bullet straight down y'all's live stream questions that you all have made. And one of the first ones that I want to address is the formatting for tomorrow's test. Questions that you guys need to be prepared for on the test. We have 15 of them that are going to be your standard stimulus response. So it'll either be images or it'll be writings that you guys are just going to need to go through, use your historical knowledge, and use your analytical skills to kind of sort through. That being said, those questions are made with the fact that this test is a little bit in a weird spot, but it has to be given soon anyway. They are made with that concept that you do have certain materials that you haven't yet had the ability to fully wrap your head around. So they're designed for that. For example, your World War II questions are designed off of what you should have taken away from World War II. There are a few of them, and the only place that you're going to find those is the stimulus response. We don't anticipate that you've had enough time to fully memorize them, so they're not going to be in your memory section. Following those 15 questions, there are going to be 10 questions that are all pretty much just going to be memory-based questions. Those 10 questions are going to be directly from what we have talked about in class, and they are mostly focused on big ideas and big key concepts that you guys can sink your head around. Again, that's going to go all the way through World War I, the Russian Revolution, the interim war period, and no causes of World War II or World War II will be on there. So the knowledge-based questions do not include World War II, but everything else that we have covered in this unit is fair game. As far as extra credit for this is concerned, just as every other test, there will be 10 points worth of extra credit to earn. That assignment will be given after the fact. This week, you guys already have enough on your plate. You don't need to worry about that extra credit just yet. You've got your EOC coming up if you haven't already taken it. And you've got this test and an article. Extra credit, I feel, would be, if it were given out this week, it would just be something else on top of a big pile of other else's. So I really want you guys to have the time and the ability to focus on it and not be bogged down by it. So we're going to wait until next week to really give that one out. All right, so I'm going to go ahead. I'm going to start working my way down this list and making sure that you guys have everything you see. I'm going to try and also keep the chat open. So if anything does pop up, I'll be able to see it. So feel free in the YouTube chat to go ahead and drop it down. It'll be a little bit easier than keeping up, I think, with new things on the live stream questions. So those are going to be up as well. All right, let's go ahead and dig our teeth in. All right, for the causes of World War I, definitely causes of World War I will be on that test. The things that you need to remember are those four main causes. You have militarism, the glorification of a military and building up of military. Most of that's to kind of keep up with everything else that we're about to talk about and to keep up with Germany's already substantial military power. So you have militarism. You have a complex system of alliances. That system of alliances is between different countries. And originally that was to kind of restore and keep a balance in Europe of power. No one country wanted to let the other countries have too much power, so they made alliances in an effort to kind of keep tug of war at a standstill. So these systems of alliances weren't made in case of a war. They were made more to prevent a war from happening. Ironically, they were one of the biggest causes of that war. So we have your militarism, you have a complex system of alliances, imperialism, which we talked at great length about last unit. That is definitely one of the biggest causes of World War I. Imperialism and the drive for natural resources lead to intensified competition between nations and lead to these nations kind of getting at each other's throats in other parts of the world, not just in Europe. And that competition that Europe has had is starting to reach a head, because then we have our final cause, which is nationalism. So those are your four main causes. One more time, that's militarism, alliances, imperialism, and nationalism. Now, nationalism is a huge deal here because each country is trying to be the best country in Europe. And they're doing that through the other three as well. Nationalism is more than just being the best, though. It's being the best at others' expense. If you are not the best, you need to make yourself the best. So if you're not the best military, the strongest military, you've got to make yourself the best. And the only way you can prove that is to actually engage the other military in conflict. So all of these combined were inert. They didn't do much on their own. They needed a catalyst. They needed something to launch them into action. And that's something, that powder keg that Otto von Bismarck is credited with saying, that powder keg is the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. Now, as Franz Ferdinand gets assassinated by the Serbian nationalist group, the Black Hand, this starts beef with Austria-Hungary. And when Austria-Hungary basically gives an ultimatum to Serbia, and then they declare war on Serbia, they start a chain reaction of events. Because once Serbia and Austria are at war, Austria-Hungary are at war, then Russia is going to join and declare war on Austria-Hungary. Then Germany declares war on Russia, and then France and Britain enter the picture, and Britain, of course, because Belgium is invaded on Germany's way to France. Now, just in case you guys were thinking that possibly this war was unanticipated, the Germans enacted something called a Schleifenplan. I'm sure I'm butchering that because German is not a language that I speak fluently. But the Schleifenplan was basically that Germany was going to go through Belgium and into France from the top, going around its fortifications and directly attacking Paris. Now, they wanted to do this first and fast so that they weren't fighting a war on two fronts. They didn't want to fight a war with France on this side and then over on the other side with Russia at the same time, because then effectively all of their troops would be divided in half, their resources divided in half. And they didn't want that. So they go on the Western Front to attack France with that Schleifenplan and try to get it done quickly. Think they're going to take an easy win. This thing has been in preparation for 9 years. So Germany was not surprised in the least by this. As they go in to try and enact this, though, the Western Front reaches a complete standstill. Neither side can really gain any ground, and because neither side could gain any ground, we see the advent of trench warfare. Now, trench warfare was a particularly brutal part of World War I. It was what made the death toll so high. Nobody could gain any ground, and all people could really do was throw bodies at each other at first. But then technology improves. Now we see airplanes being part of war. At first just as scouts, and then over time throughout World War I, they became fighter pilots. We see tanks in World War I start to arise, and we see mustard gas. Those three are some of the biggest aspects that come from trench warfare in an effort to stop that standstill on the Western Front. Moving forward from the Western Front, if we look at the Eastern Front, now, Germany and Kaiser Wilhelm are kind of stuck between those two sides they didn't want to be stuck between. Austria-Hungary is an ally, but they aren't really helping Germany out as much as Germany had anticipated they would. And then Italy, still on the sidelines at first, will eventually join up with the other allied powers. So, again, to recap, we have the allied powers, which is going to be France, Great Britain, Italy, Russia, and eventually the United States. Then on the other side, we have the Central Powers. Those are going to be Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire, who joins in also, again, kind of to combat Russia and kind of to gain more lands into the European area that they've been starting to lose over time. Let's see. So on the Eastern Front, this one's a pretty clear victory. Germany has pretty much all of the advantages. They've got industrialized troops. They've got better trained troops, more organized troops. Russia still has a very feudal system. I mean, most places still kind of carry titles, but Russia's is very feudal. So they have serfs and they have aristocrats as their officers. But the big issue with Russia is they've got the people. They don't have the industrialized weaponry that everybody else does. So as things start to develop on the Eastern Front, it becomes very clear very quickly that Germany is definitely stronger than Russia. And just to kind of point towards what's coming here, Russia is not happy that they're in this war in the first place. The Tsar has entered this war. The people didn't. They called it the Tsar's War. It was a supremely unpopular move. And it's one of the things that's going to lead to, in 1917, Russia pulling out of World War I because of an internal revolution. Then if we look at the Southern Front, you don't need to know too much about it, but know that since Ottoman Empire joined in, then Britain's going to pull in its extra troops from those regions. So some big things to think about for World War I, big key events. You've got the Battle of the Somme and the Battle at Verdun. Both of those are long-lasting battles on the Western Front in France. Both of them led to very little, if any, ground being gained by either side. It just led to several deaths. The two combined will lend to 1.5 million troops dying. Those two battles are rough, and they show exactly what situation Britain and France are in 1917 when Tsar Nicholas has to contend with that Russian Revolution. Now let's go ahead and let's shift over to that Russian Revolution before we end World War I, because that's when it takes place. It takes place in 1917, 1 year before the end of World War I. So what happens in Russia is, through a long time, you've had the czars, the kings, in absolute control of Russia. They are complete absolutists. They believe that God put them there and they will maintain it. And that's why Tsar Nicholas doesn't rightly care for public opinion when he enters this war. They're just going to do what he says, or so he thinks. So the war starts, things look bad. Germany is steamrolling over Russia, and then eventually Germany sees this and offers Russia a chance to get out. They offer them a peace treaty. Granted, it was not a very kind peace treaty, but they offered them one. And Tsar Nicholas turns it down. Now, this was just fuel on an already raging fire. People at the front lines in Russia started to leave their weapons and go home. They were done with the war. They didn't listen to their troops. They didn't listen to their officers, and things started to break up into chaos. This was further cemented with the first wave of the Russian Revolution, the February Revolution. So what happens is the Tsar is losing more and more power. He tries to hold on too firmly. He's got a weak heir. We've got the influence of Rasputin coming in, and everything in Russia just seems to mean that the Romanovs are just losing more and more influence. Romanovs, sorry. And this is especially exacerbated by the fact that Tsar Nicholas's wife is German, and he leaves her in control when he goes to the front lines, which means that they go to fight Germany, leaving a German in control of Russia. So every decision that Tsar Nicholas makes just seems to further how unpopular he really was. And so the February Revolution it was very clear that he was not going to be paying attention to the Russian parliament. So the parliament takes complete control. That parliament, again, is called the Duma. So the Russian Duma takes control of the government, and the Tsar loses his power. Now, he's still alive at this point, but he loses his power during the February Revolution. And what takes control is a moderate government. A moderate government is not one that is too radical, and it is not one that is too conservative. And what they're trying to do is to find almost a medium. Some other things that kind of played into this are the role of the intelligentsia, the Russian intellects who had been sent to Europe to study. These intellects come back with a lot of European thought, and it contradicts with the way that Russia is. So they encourage this act of rebellion, this act of revolution, because it's clear that nothing's changing for the peasants. So the peasantry rises in the February revolutions, and then the October Revolution comes around, and this is where we have the rise of the Bolsheviks. So the Bolsheviks rallied around this cry of peace, land, and bread. These are the three things that the Russian people had been asking for that none of these governments had been giving them yet. So they want peace. That's one of the first things they do. In 1917, when Lenin and the Bolsheviks take control in Russia in October, one of the first things they'll do is enact a peace treaty with Germany, an embarrassing peace treaty with Germany, but a peace treaty with Germany that pulls them out of the war. This is one of the things that their people wanted more than anything. So they gained a big bump in popularity there. But then they had to focus on fighting a civil war in Russia. The other two, land and bread, these are rallying cries of the lower classes. They wanted bread. That was one of the things that they were trying to get. And during a war, the bread lines were not feeding them enough. And the Tsar, again, seemed to be turning a deaf ear to this. So the Bolsheviks took advantage of that. They took advantage of land for the peasantry, those working out in the fields. So then the Bolsheviks take control, pull Russia out of World War I, which changes the narrative of World War I, because now Kaiser Wilhelm is not fighting a war on two fronts. He's not fighting a war in the Western Front at a standstill and a war in the Eastern Front, as well as a war at sea with the underboats or the undersea boats attacking the German or the British blockades. He's not focused on all of these different fronts at once. Now he can take all of the troops from Russia and focus them all on that Western Front to try and surge past the British and the French, because a lot of those actions had led to the America joining the war. So the United States joins the war again because of the sinking of the Lusitania, unannounced U-boat attacks by Germany, the Zimmermann telegram, and the fact that they had such strong ties with the Allied forces already. So once America does eventually join the war, it's a race. Germany is trying to beat France and Britain before America joins with fresh troops, but they don't get it done in time. So America joins up, they've got the fresh troops, and they have this final surge to push back on Germany. So the big names or events that you guys need for World War I, you need to recall trench warfare. You need to think about those new technologies, the gas, the tanks, the planes, those things that mowed through. You need to know that Russia left during the war because they had to sign that peace treaty with Germany that just wasn't quite fair to Russia just to get out of the war. Those are the really key events in World War I you need to know. For the Russian Revolution, those specifics that you need to know, the Bolsheviks, their rallying cry, why the revolution happened. Those are really the issues that you need to focus on. And the intelligentsia are always good to know. Next up, the effects of World War I. All kind of rally around those Paris peace talks. Once World War I was over, Great Britain and France were seeking one thing: to punish Germany. Austria-Hungary split apart. Austria-Hungary was no more. It was now Austria and a number of other Balkan lands. The Ottoman Empire also split apart. It was no longer the Ottoman Empire. It was a hodgepodge of different things that we're going to talk about a little bit later in the Paris peace talks. All that's left is Germany. And so they become the scapegoat for the entire thing. Yes, they were the aggressors. However, as we've spoken before this war was just tension that had built up over so long. It was inevitable. It was probably going to happen. It was just sped along by events that transpired because of Austria-Hungary and Germany. So Germany needs to be punished is the way that France and England see this. However, Wilson's 14 points are trying to encourage peace. So Wilson's 14 points he brings up before the end of the war, and he tries to establish a couple of things. The biggest one you need to know from that is the League of Nations. The League of Nations would be an alliance of all nations trying to maintain peace through diplomatic means. Now, this was a good idea. This is one that we still have in organization today with the UN. Think about it as the predecessor of the UN that just kind of wasn't quite put together very well. The reason it wasn't put together well is because two of the bigger superpowers during the time, the newly rising US as a world superpower, and Russia, did not join. Russia didn't join because they were busy, and the US at home, this war became very unpopular because it was viewed as us fighting a war, losing American lives in a war that was overseas and did not affect us. So following World War I, they retreat back into a policy of isolationism. So Wilson does not end up being able to convince them to vote to join the League of Nations. This kind of cripples it, and we're going to see this cycle back around leading up to World War II. So other than that, the Paris peace talks are all about how are we going to do this? And the big takeaways here are the Treaty of Versailles and the Mandate System. The Treaty of Versailles is the treaty with Germany, which basically it's a bum deal for Germany. They've got to admit complete fault for the war. Then they have to pay the bill for the war. Again, they don't finish paying that until 2010, as in like 9 years ago, that they finally finished paying this off. It was a big debt to stick a Germany with that was already suffering economic effects from this war. So they put everything on Germany. Germany had to pay all this back, and it put Germany in a really tight spot. We're going to cycle back to this in just a minute when we talk about the Great Depression. So the Weimar Republic is now in charge in Germany, and they are trying to do their best to pay this debt off. But that's not all that the Treaty of Versailles does. it also cuts off their ability to militarize. They are limited in the troops and technology that they have, and they are moved out of the Rhineland in Germany, which is that land between France and Germany that they demilitarize. Again, all of this is going to cycle back whenever we start looking at World War II. In the Americas, following the war, they actually had an economic surge. So they were doing very well economically, and they thought that that was the way it was just going to go forever. So people were buying into stocks, and they were buying it with credit. We're going to come back. In Europe, at first, after the war, they had an economic downturn, but it seemed as if every country, including Germany and the Weimar Republic, was starting to kind of reach an equilibrium in the tail end of the 1920s. However, because the United States had become the new centralized currency for the world, once 1929 rolls around, things start to shift in a bad direction. In the United States, people had been buying stocks with credit, which means that they didn't have the money to buy the stocks. They just bought it because they knew it was a sure bet. You know, it's always going up. But then one day it didn't. And what was called Black Tuesday, what ends up happening is that the stock market starts to dip. And once it starts to dip even further, people start to panic and sell their stocks. Once that starts to happen, they dip and dip and dip and dip. And what happens is that the people who had spent their money that they didn't even have on these stocks now can't pay the banks back. If you can't pay the banks back, they don't have enough money to give people when they come by. And so this massive panic happens in the US. People run to the banks to try and pull out their life savings before the bank shuts down and they lose it all, which in turn causes the banks to close. This panic actually transfers across seas too. So in Britain, in France, you see the same thing happening. In addition to that, the US banks had been loaning Germany money to pay back France to pay back the US. So once the US dollar starts to drop, so does Germany's, and the banks start to ask Germany to pay its money back. They can't do that. So now the banks lose even more. That causes Germany to spiral into what will eventually become hyperinflation, to where their money was so worthless they had to wheelbarrow it around just to buy stuff. They used it to burn. They used it as wallpaper because it wasn't even worth the paper that they printed it on. Things got bad in Germany. And all of this, the root cause of all of this, is unemployment. As these banks collapse, yes, money is an issue, but the biggest issue is if people can't work, they can't buy things. If they can't buy things, it doesn't keep going. And that's what caused the dip in the first place. People didn't have enough money to buy the goods that were being manufactured in factories, so factories started to close. Once these factories close, their workers lose money, they lose their job, and eventually what happens in the United States is we reach an unemployment rate of about 25%. Now, when FDR comes in with his New Deal and tries to fix that, he addresses a lot of the problem, but still doesn't address that root cause of unemployment. He gets it down to about 16% before World War II really hits. So the reason that the Great Depression continues to last for so long is that reason of unemployment. That Great Depression, though, in Europe also causes a bit of a vacuum. It causes a lot of tension, which leads to fascist and absolutists or totalitarian rulers being able to take control more easily. So this is where we start to see Hitler and Mussolini seeing this weak nation, seeing the weakness of the economy, seeing people losing their jobs, and starting to focus on that as their platform. And that helps them to rise in power so much. For the interim war, in addition, to kind of discuss a few things before we move on to fascism, we need to make sure that you guys understand that the Qing dynasty will collapse during this time. It collapses in turn because of internal struggles between nationalists and communists, and because they had had external forces kind of weighing down on China for the latter half of the 18th century. So as they start to collapse, you start to see the rise of nationalism and communism in China, and those forces will continue to combat throughout the interim war era and following World War II until we eventually have the establishment of Mao Zedong's new Republic of China. In Europe, turning our attention back to Europe, The same thing is happening in the Ottoman Empire with the mandate system. The Ottoman Empire is starting to fracture, in part due to internal struggles, but also due to those external struggles. So Great Britain and France come in and basically divide up the Ottoman Empire in what they call the mandate system, because the Arab countries aren't quite ready to kind of take control for themselves yet. They feel like, we need to help you understand it. So this is an example of how imperialism is going to continue, even possibly become a little bit more involved. And it's also an example of social Darwinism that rises back up following World War I. So, for example, Iraq and Syria, a lot of the problems that they have is because Britain and France drew the lines, not taking into account who the people who lived there were, and then putting into place government systems that are of minority groups there rather than of the majority. So it causes a lot of tensions between those ethnic groups. And then even on top of that, Britain promises the Zionists that they're going to establish a Jewish state in Palestine, which is ruled mostly by Arabs. So Britain really kind of, after World War I, muddles around with what used to be the Ottoman Empire because of that mandate system. So we've got China, we've got the Ottoman Empire, and now in Europe you have these countries collapsing because of their economy. And it becomes a lot easier for people like Mussolini and Hitler to take control. So Mussolini comes in, very displeased with the way that Italy performed in World War I, and is able to rise to power through a concept called fascism. Now, this concept is all about power of the state, and what Mussolini does is he defines it as a combination of state and corporation, or businesses or groups of people. So you take the state, and now the state is going to take control of private organizations. So no more unions. Now it is state-run labor. The only difference here is you still have capitalism under a fascist dictatorship, but the only people who really run things are those who are of that nationalistic mindset, of that same background that they're trying to preach. So in Italy, under Mussolini, it is all about the state. He says, it is the state, nothing against the state, nothing outside the state. It is all the state. So it doesn't matter what you believe. It doesn't matter who you are as a person. As long as you are part of the state as a whole, you are insignificant. The state, the organism, is what matters. He does this through intense nationalism and pride, as well as violence and intimidation of his own people. So this is that ugly side of nationalism that we talked about with World War I rising its head. So anything that they felt wasn't Italian enough, they would intimidate, they would bully, and they would use violent acts against. And this is not new for Mussolini. He has done this for oftentimes in his life. But it gets worse and worse. He has his black shirt thugs go around Italy beating those who are not Italian enough. So Mussolini gathers control through intense nationalism and rises up through this because of that Great Depression. It created the capability for him to rise, the ease of him to rise. The same thing happens in Germany with Hitler. Now, both of them share remarkable characteristics. They both focus on educating the youth to that mentality. For example, in Germany, Hitler uses Hitler's youth to kind of educate the youth onto what makes a good German. They both direct their people's anger and hatred from the First World War towards certain groups of people. Anti-Semitism also rises after this, which again relates back to those Zionists around World War I who were already kind of seeing this pattern develop. So anti-Semitism rises in both Italy and in Germany. You also see the bullying of immigrant groups in both of those places. So as these fascists rise to power, this is going to be one of those causes that leads us into World War II. Now, just to kind of speak for a moment on fascism and communism, both of them are totalitarian systems, but they're two sides to the same coin. They're two opposite ends. Fascism is basically a totalitarian government system with a liberal economic system in place. So countrymen can run their own businesses, countrymen can make their own decisions about money, but your life and your pride in your nation is tied up to the state. Your corporation is tied up to the state. Whereas communism, especially when we're talking about Stalinism more than Marxism, this is a totalitarian regime where your leader not only controls your life, but also controls your economy. He tells you how much to produce of what, when to have it done, and gives you those quotas. Next up, the intra-war we've kind of just walked through. And for World War II, what you really need to know about World War II, it starts up because of Hitler's mobilization. Again, think about if you give a mouse a cookie. So Hitler starts to mobilize. He starts to militarize. You have an increased amount of nationalism, a complex system of alliances. You have imperialism. Wait a minute. All of this is just the causes of World War I with Hitler and the Treaty of Versailles added into it. That's pretty much World War II. So World War II is an exercise in learning from your mistakes. So the Treaty of Versailles was one of the bigger causes. The end of World War I is one of the direct causes of World War II. If you punish somebody so severely they have nothing left to lose, then they have nothing left to lose. Hitler had nothing left to lose, so he moves into the Rhineland, because what else are you going to do to us? We have lost so much already. And so we militarize to make money for our people, to get them out of this Great Depression. And so we move because we have this nationalistic idea. You wounded their pride so severely, they had to rise back up. So World War II is just, that's pretty much kind of a brief summation of it. There's so much more to it. But in brief, it's because Hitler sees the Western powers not wanting to go to war again. He sees the weakness of them, and he has that anger and nationalism pushing him forward. And as he goes forward, he realizes that France and Britain aren't going to do anything about it. They don't want another war, so much to the point that they will appease him with whatever he wants. But as we all know, like if a kid throws a temper tantrum in a grocery store and you give them the candy they're asking for, next time they're in the grocery store, that just means they need to throw a temper tantrum to get what they want. Appeasement did not work like that. So Hitler just continued to grow until he invades Poland, and in 1939, World War II commences. Now, during World War II, it seemed that Hitler and the Nazi Party were pretty much going to win. They stormed through France with blitzkrieg, that lightning warfare. They were bombarding Britain, and it seemed as if it was only a matter of time before Britain surrendered. So then Hitler makes one of his biggest blunders, and he turns his attention to Russia with Operation Barbarossa. Yes, you need to know the name, Operation Barbarossa, where he turns to Russia and tries to invade and take over to kind of preemptively attack Stalin. He doesn't do too well. And in fact, he's beaten back pretty badly. He didn't learn from the mistakes of prior people in history. Again, don't look at the Mongols for your example. Mongols don't ever count, ever, especially in invading Russia. But Napoleon does. And Hitler does almost the exact same thing as Napoleon does. He starts his invasion in summer, and then winter sets in. Once winter sets in, the Russians have scorched all of the earth. You have nothing to gather and no shelter. So Hitler loses a lot of troops and a lot of supplies trying to invade somebody he had a non-aggression pact with in an effort to try and beat him to the punch. So after that, Hitler was weakened and then had to contend with an Allied force that was ready to push back. He only did it because he didn't think the Allied forces could push back. And unfortunately for him, he was very wrong there. We're not going to have on that exam too much about the latter parts of World War II because you've only had about a day to really wrap your head around it. It's more about the causes and the early events of World War II. So that'll be about the end of it. I'm going to really quickly, I'm going to read through these comments to make sure that I address everything. For the Russian Revolution, we're going to check that one off. It's a little bit further back in there. It's right at the tail end of World War I. Ali, for the quizzes for this test, let me explain. Funny story. Sorry about this. I didn't have a voice last week. And so Wednesday, I had a test for my K-level classes, and on Tuesday I was starting to lose my voice so much that at the end I had to type everything in. So the PowerPoint that you guys were connected to was the one that I was typing on, and that was the one that I was trying to tell my K classes what was going on. So that was their quizzes. I can definitely post it for you guys in there. However, it isn't aligned to our test; it's aligned to theirs. But it is a good one for kind of overview of information. So it wouldn't be a bad thing for you guys to have. I'll post that as soon as I'm done with this video. Abby, for authoritarianism, Authoritarianism it's a big ism. It was used in a lot of places, and that you can mostly tie into your totalitarian rules. So authoritarianism you can equate with Hitler, you can equate with Stalin, you can equate with Franco in Spain. But it's pretty much a broad statement that kind of goes over those totalitarian regimes. Venki, a skeleton list of what will be on the test. We've pretty much covered everything that'll be on the test. Everything. It's World War I, Russian Revolution. Focus on your causes of World War I, your effects of World War I. You need to focus on collapse of empires and states. You need to focus on the start to World War II. Those are the real big ones. World War II notes in Google Classroom. I did post earlier today. I'll check those again for all classes and make sure that you guys have them all. Caleb, you do have an article for Friday. However, it's not an article about World War II on Friday. The article that you guys have for Friday, if you have started reading it, you'll start to realize it's dealing with the aftermath of World War II. It's actually more of an introduction into the sentiment that's around during the Cold War. So it's nothing to do with what's on the test. It's more to do with what's to come. Benjamin, yeah, extra credit is coming next week. Neither victims nor executioners, yes. And this is, again, dealing with the aftermath of World War II. This is something that is written during the time. It's heavily opinionated, as I'm sure if you started to read it, you can tell. And I'd love to discuss those biases with you. So please really think about it. You don't have to agree with what the authors are saying. Come into discussion ready to talk about it, ready to have a discourse, because that's what really matters, is your ideas on it and how you interact with the material, how you have that conversation. We're not all going to agree on everything. We're not lemmings. We've got to be able to figure it out for ourselves. So ladies and gentlemen, that about wraps up the overview. If there are any more specific questions, I'd be really happy to address them. I'm going to give you guys about a minute and a half to kind of wrap everything up here. Other than that, guys, this test is multiple choice. It was not designed to kill you. It was designed as a test to see if you took away from this unit what you should have taken away from it. And everything that we've covered today is on the test. Well, everything that we've covered today deals with the test. I'm not going to say that everything that I've said is going to be on the test, but we definitely have covered everything that is on the test today. Big names you need to know. You need to know your leaders. You need to know your fascists, your communists, your Bolsheviks. You need to know Woodrow Wilson, Churchill, Stalin, Tojo. I want you to be aware of Franco. We're gonna discuss him a little bit more after the test, though. He's not on the test, so you don't need to know Franco yet. Ho Chi Minh, you should be familiar with. I'm not sure if he's on the test or if I killed that question. But pretty much your big leaders you need to know, and that'll be all that I really test you on. Meiji Japan is not on this test. That one was on our last test. Caleb, why does communism set in Russia? Are they communistic before World War II? Yes, Caleb, following the Russian Revolution, the October Revolution is when the Bolsheviks, the communists, take control. Russia becomes communist because they promise what the Tsar was turning his blind eye to. They promise peace. They don't want to be in World War I. They promise bread because the peasants weren't, or the proletariat, the workers in the city, weren't getting enough of it in the bread lines. And they promised land because the peasants did not have access to the land they needed. So what they promise is everything that their government, that they were distasteful towards, wasn't giving them. That's how communism was able to set in. In addition to that, Stalinism takes it even a step further, and that he eliminates any kind of political rivals and sets up a one-party system. And what that'll do is that basically eliminates the desire to compete against it for so long, because if you even had spoken out against something that he did, you had the potential to be arrested. It was a rough time to be there for us Westerners, at least for those of us who place a lot of value on individual freedoms rather than the good of the state. Let's see. Do we have anything else that we need to respond to? Final call for questions, guys. Go ahead and type them up if you got them. No problem, Caleb. All right, y'all. If you have any questions for me tomorrow before the exam, make sure they're direct. Make sure they're very specific. But that's pretty much the overview of the unit. I'm really hoping that in my fever I didn't skip over anything. But at any rate, guys, I know y'all are going to do great on the test. I know that you guys have a good head on your shoulders, and as long as you guys keep a cool head and as long as you keep focused tomorrow, you should be fine. All right, everybody, good luck. It's Boudreaux signing off.